Hi, folks. Here we are again, taking another dive into that fascinating and sometimes terrifying world of democratic governance. Now, if you happen to catch my last video, Is Democracy Failing? AI Can Show Us a Better Way? You might remember how my AI friend, Claude, identified some core principles of democratic systems like separation of power, checks against authoritarian overreach, independent institutions, and voting rights protection. Well, about that. Today, we're going to examine some of the changes that we might actually see now that the Trump administration is back in power. And, spoiler alert, some of these changes may make those democratic ideals sound more like suggestions than principles. Now, before anyone starts writing those angry comments, let's be clear. I'm not here to fearmonger or play political games. I'm just your friendly political observer, armed with too much caffeine, a reasonable knowledge of history, and a concern about where we're headed. Think of me as your designated driver through the wild terrain that is American politics. I'm sober enough to see the potholes, but I still want to enjoy the ride. So buckle up. We're about to analyze how the electoral processes and presidential powers might be changing in ways that, might make the Founding Fathers either spin in their graves or maybe even think, yeah, we saw that coming. Hell, I don't know, they might be thinking, yep, that's exactly what we intended. Well, unfortunately, we don't have the Founding Fathers here to interview. So instead, let's take a quick look at what Claude thinks. This is the prompt I gave it. Given the current Trump administration, what changes can we expect to the electoral process and to the powers of the presidency? Now, Claude's basing his answer on the historical patterns and the Trump administration's previous tender from 2017 to 2021. Several potential changes to the electoral process and presidential powers could emerge. You can see here that Claude starts with changes to the electoral process in the individual states. Now, there is one thing that Americans love more than democracy, and that's arguing about how to do democracy. So first off, we're likely to see increased pressure on the state legislatures to, let's call it, modify election laws. The word modify here means anything from reasonable security updates to changes that would make it harder for your grandma to vote than to buy an assault rifle. Actually, I think that's already given, isn't it? Next up, Claude suggests possible restrictions on mail-in votings, drop boxes, and early voting periods, with enhanced voter ID requirements and stricter voter roll maintenance. Apparently, making voting convenient is now controversial. It's like we're trying to return to our roots. You know, where you had to own land, have a penis, and ride a horse uphill both ways to cast your ballot. We could expect a renewed focus on election integrity measures that might include federal oversight of state elections. Now, that's going to be an interesting one given the Constitution of the United States. There may be potential challenges to the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022 and possible attempts to modify the Federal Election Commission's structure or enforcement capabilities. Well, here's where it gets interesting. We might see attempts to expand legislative control over election certification. Imagine if your state legislature could look at election results and say, we don't like these numbers, let's go with different ones. Kind of like letting the losing team in a football game vote on whether the scoreboard reflects an accurate outcome. Now, at the federal level, you can expect a renewed focus on election integrity measures. Yeah, I'm using air quotes so much I might develop carpal tunnel. These measures could include federal oversight of state elections, which is ironic given the traditional conservative position on states' rights. But hey, consistency is overrated when power's at stake, isn't it? I remember when election integrity meant making sure everyone who could vote did vote, and their vote was counted accurately. Nowadays, it seems more to mean something like making sure the right people vote the right way. Kind of like when my kids refined cleaning their room to mean shoving everything under the bed, technically accomplishing the goal, but missing the point entirely. And then there's redistricting, or as I like to call it, Choose Your Own Adventure, Democracy Edition. We're likely to see support for partisan gerrymandering. Wherever one party controls the state legislature, districts get drawn to look like modern art installations, and communities are split up like a divorced couple's record collection. Is that a district, or did somebody spill spaghetti on the map? Both. The answer is both. Part 2, the presidential power expansion. Now let's talk about presidential power, because if there's one thing we've learned from history, it's that executives love to test the boundaries, like teenagers with curfews. First, expect expanded use of executive orders to bypass Congress. Well, we're already seeing that happen. It's like the governmental equivalent of, I'm not touching you. Like siblings play in the back seat. Technically within the rules, maximally annoying to everyone else involved. They'd also like to see broader interpretation of emergency powers. And remember, nothing says emergency quite like situations that have existed for years, but suddenly become urgent when you need to circumvent the legislative process. It's like declaring a homework emergency in college. Sure, you've known about it all semester, but now it's urgent. Now, here's where things get spicy. There's talk of re-implementing something called Schedule F, which sounds really boring, but it's actually kind of terrifying. It would let the president reclassify thousands of federal employees from protected civil servants to political appointees. So imagine if your mail carrier, your tax auditor, and the scientist monitoring nuclear waste could all be fired and replaced based on their political loyalty. Kind of like turning the entire federal government into one giant campaign office. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, who needs expertise when you have enthusiasm? Who needs institutional knowledge when you have ideological purity? Should you really replace your doctor with somebody who believes in healing crystals? Sure, they're passionate, but maybe not the ones that you want removing your appendix. We're also looking at political assertions of stronger presidential control over the Department of Justice, because nothing says rule of law quite like the chief executive directing criminal investigations, especially those that might involve him or his associates. This is particularly concerning when it comes to investigations involving political figures. It's one thing to have theoretical presidential oversight. It's another to have, well, no one rid me of this rogue prosecutor energy coming from the Oval Office. There just could be some potential conflicts over the scope of executive privilege. Maybe the Supreme Court should take another look at that. Cool. Now Claude is giving us some historical context. These potential changes reflect ongoing tensions in American democracy between federalism and centralized control, between executive efficiency versus checks and balances, electoral access versus security concerns, and political accountability versus institutional independence. Now, I think we can all agree that these tensions are real and pose problems. But are the presented solutions real? Again, that air quotes thing, right? Now, for many of these goals, the actual implementation and success of the changes would depend on congressional composition and willingness to act. However, given that the entire Congress at the moment is controlled by one political party, that could certainly facilitate change. Judicial review by federal courts and state government resistance or cooperation. I do think these changes are going to be the most difficult to overcome because of that opinion piece called the U.S. Constitution. Public opinion and civic engagement, well, that's us. We, the people, expressing our opinion in rallies and in protests. There might be institutional resistance to their attempts, but history shows that presidents can both influence the electoral processes and the executive power during their tenure. The good news is that lasting change typically requires constitutional amendments, sustained legislative majorities, or gradual norms erosion over multiple administrations. I do believe there's significant risk on that front at the moment. So why do these matter to democracy? What's the big deal? Well, as Claude points out here, democratic systems depend on institutions checking each other's power. If you put all the power in one of the branches of government, you're losing that ability. So when executive authority expands without oversight, it creates opportunities for abuse, and that can cascade into broader democratic breakdown. The undermining of election integrity. Democracy kind of requires that citizens trust the outcomes of the elections. Any changes that even appear designed to advantage one party or restrict participation is going to delegitimize the entire democratic process, even when the elections remain technically free. And then there's institutional capture. When traditionally nonpartisan institutions become political tools like the Department of Justice, they lose their ability to serve as neutral arbiters and guardians of democratic norms. And that creates a reinforcing cycle of polarization and institutional decay. Here's another reason these things matter. Historical warning signs. Actually, political scientists already identified these patterns as indicating democratic backsliding in other nations, like attacking the legitimacy of elections, politicizing law enforcement and intelligence services, undermining civil service independence, expanding executive power at the expense of other branches, and restricting voter access in the name of security. Those are things that historically we have always seen lead us down the rose path to fascism. Here's my biggest concern. Democracy runs on trust, like a car runs on gas, unless it's electric, of course. Citizens need to trust that their elections are fair and that laws apply equally, that the institutions serve the public rather than partisan interests. When that trust erodes, then the whole system starts to sputter. I remember teaching a daughter of mine how to ride a bike. The moment she stopped trusting that I would catch her if she fell, she couldn't pedal anymore. She just froze. Democracy is in the same state. When citizens stop trusting the process, participation drops, cynicism rises, and suddenly we're all frozen, unable to move forward together. Now, before you start building that underground bunker or researching property in New Zealand, let me offer some hope. Because American democracy, well, kind of like a cockroach or that fruitcake that you had 3 Christmases ago, it is surprisingly hard to kill. Fortunately, we have federalism. 50 states doing 50 different things, often simultaneously and often very contradictory. It's inefficient, it's messy, and right now it might be our saving grace. When federal institutions falter, the states can step up, kind of like having backup singers who can carry the tune when the lead vocalist goes off key. We still have an independent judiciary that can check illegal or unconstitutional actions. And you've seen this in practice. Yes, the courts have become somewhat more politicized, but judges still have lifetime appointments. And many take their constitutional role seriously. Now, it's not perfect, but it's like having a referee that might favor one team over the other, but still won't allow either team to bring brass knuckles onto the field. And then there's U.S. civic institutions, free press advocacy groups, and engaged citizens. We're like democracy's immune system. When threats emerge, we respond, sometimes slowly, sometimes imperfectly, but we respond. Plus, we Americans are remarkably ornery when we're pushed too far. We might disagree on everything from pizza toppings to fundamental rights, but tell us we can't do something, and suddenly we're all patriots, wrapped in a flag, demanding our freedom. It is simultaneously our most annoying and most endearing quality. So what's the path forward? Now what? Well, where does this leave us? Facing potential changes that could reshape American democracy, but not powerless to respond. History shows us that democratic erosion is rarely irreversible if citizens act early and decisively. The key is recognizing that protecting democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires participation and sometimes uncomfortable coalition building with people you might prefer to avoid at family dinners. Because here's the truth. The politicians pushing these changes aren't movie villains twirling their mustaches. They generally believe their vision of democracy is good for them. The problem is that their vision might not include you or your neighbor or that person you disagree with on Twitter, but who still deserves representation. Look, I know this has been heavy. We've covered potential threats to voting rights, expansion of executive power, and the politicization of crucial institutions. It's enough to make anyone want to retreat into cat videos and pretend politics doesn't exist. But here's the thing, and this is important. We're not helpless. History is full of examples where ordinary citizens successfully defended and strengthened democratic institutions against seemingly insurmountable odds. From the civil rights movement to anti-corruption campaigns, from suffragettes to modern-day election defenders, regular people have always been democracy's best guardians. That's why in my next video, I'm going to be laying out a concrete action plan, not pie-in-the-sky idealism or partisan wish lists, but practical steps that individuals and small groups can take to protect and strengthen democratic institutions. We'll talk about everything from local organizing to leveraging technology, from building unlikely coalitions to creating lasting institutional changes. Because if there's one thing that I have learned from studying democracy and talking to AI about governance, it's that the system is only as strong as the people willing to defend it. And despite everything, despite the challenges, the setbacks, the moments that feels like we're sliding backward, I still believe there are enough of us who care about self-governance to make a difference. So yes, democracy is under pressure. Yes, we're facing real threats to the institutions and norms that make representative government possible. But no, we're not defeated. Not yet. Not if we act. So please, join me next time when we move from diagnosis to treatment, from identifying problems to implementing solutions, because knowing what's wrong is only the first step. Fixing it is where the real work begins. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, democracy is not something we have, it's something we do, and we've got work to do. So thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, comments, or ideas on this video or any of the others, we highly encourage you to add comments and likes below so that more people get access to this information. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.